Good evening. My name is Mark Mamagonian. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs for the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, NAASR. And on behalf of NAASR and the co-sponsor of tonight's program, the Society for Armenian Studies, thank you for making time to join us. Tonight is the sixth annual Professor Charles B. Garabedian Lecture, and I will explain a bit more about that in a moment. Let me remind you that both NAASR and the Society for Armenian Studies are membership-based organizations that depend on your dues and donations to do our work in support of Armenian studies. These are two closely aligned organizations that do valuable work, and I urge you to learn more about what we do and to donate and become a member. There's some sound coming from somewhere. Got it. Very good. Let me just briefly mention a couple of upcoming programs. After the Thanksgiving break, on Monday, December 1st at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 Eastern, very pleased to be co-sponsoring a webinar with Dr. Simon Mahakian, Past Proofing the Future, Theorizing the Erasure of Julfa 20 Years On. If you know anything about this particular topic, you will know that the name of Simon Mahakian, who has done very valuable work on the documentation of the erasure of the Armenian Khachkars of old Julfa and related topics. This is organized by the UCLA Promise Armenian Institute, and we are pleased to be a co-sponsor. On Wednesday, December 3rd, at the University of Michigan, author Aram Merjoyan will speak on his new work, and the title of the talk is Writing Waterline. The name of his book is Waterline, Patterns in Contemporary Armenian Diaspora Narratives. This is at the University of Michigan and also online. And on Thursday, December 4th at Harvard, and Saturday, December 6th here at NAASR, we're pleased to be partnering with the Mashdot's Chair in Armenian Studies at Harvard on a lecture and a seminar with visiting scholar from Armenia who will be speaking on cultural, artistic, and linguistic expressions of the Orthodox Armenians, the case of monumental painting, and an overview of shared artistic traditions between Armenia and Byzantium. Finally, on Thursday, December 18th, we will have our Christmas open house with a lecture by Professor Christina Moranci of Harvard entitled, intriguingly, A Curious Connection, Worcestershire Sauce, Yerishe Tadavosian, and an Unpublished Armenian Hymnal, Sharaknots, at Harvard. I want to know more. I hope you want to know more. I'm very curious indeed how this is going to be connected, but I have every confidence that it will be done in a very interesting and illuminating manner. Now, as I mentioned, tonight's lecture is the annual Professor Charles B. Garabedian Lecture, which has been established at NAASR by Professor Garabedian's niece, NAASR board member Joan Collegian. Thank you, Joan, for your support and for being here. Professor Garabedian was born in 1917, died in 1991. He was born in Everett, Massachusetts, and graduated from Tufts University and Boston University Law School. During World War II, he served in the Office of Strategic Services, and in the late 1940s, he began his teaching career at Suffolk University Law School in Boston. At the time of his death, he was the senior faculty professor at Suffolk University Law School, and we're honored to remember him through this lecture series. And to be welcoming our speaker tonight to give the talk. Dr. Benjamin Alexander, it's hard for me to believe, but it has now been 20 years since Ben was a regular visitor here when he was writing his dissertation, Armenian and American, The Changing Face of Ethnic Identity and Diasporan Nationalism, which he defended at the City University of New York in 2005. It was a pleasure through those years that he was coming here to do research, to discuss his ongoing work with him as it evolved first into his dissertation and as it has continued to evolve in the years since to arrive in its final form as the book Ararat in America, Armenian-American Culture and Politics in the 20th Century, which was published by I.B. Tauris in 2024 in their excellent series, Armenians in the Modern and Early Modern World, which is edited by Bedros Dermatosian. When Ben embarked on his research for his dissertation, frankly, there was very little scholarly work being done in the area of Armenian-American history. I'm pleased that the situation today is somewhat better, and while there is still much to be done, at least one can see that there is some movement and an increase in the number of scholars taking an interest in it. And Ben was certainly in the vanguard in that respect in taking on this project. Dr. Alexander is an adjunct associate professor at New York City College of Technology. And in addition to Ararat in America, he is the author of Coxey's Army, Popular Protest in the Gilded Age, published by Johns Hopkins Press in 2015, and The New Deal's Forest Army, How the Civilian Conservation Corps Worked, Johns Hopkins 2018. Please welcome Dr. Benjamin Alexander.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk, and thank you for all the years of supportiveness and encouragement and assistance that you've given me through those stages of research that you have just described yourself. And I also want to congratulate you and NAASR on this beautiful building, which I am seeing for the first time tonight. I knew the old building very well. The old building had its charm, and the old building, when you were in the old building, you knew that this was a place that had a long, distinguished history behind it. Now, in this building, in this beautiful new building, we see a place, we see an establishment that has a long future ahead of it, which is equally important. So, congratulations on the new building, and thank you very much for this opportunity. And I want to make sure that you're aware of these two excellent books that have preceded mine and that were of great help to me in my own research. Not only the books, but their authors. Robert Myrack, who passed away this past summer, was very helpful and encouraging to me over the years. He read work of mine and commented on it and made materials available to me. And Ani Bakalian, the funny thing, when I started the research, I knew her book. And then one day, when I was at the CUNY Graduate Center, where I was getting my PhD, I looked at my school email, and I saw that there was a mass email to the Graduate Center community that came from her. And I said, "My Lord, does this mean that she's here?" And yes, indeed, she had just taken a staff position at the Graduate Center as Assistant Director of a Middle Eastern Research Institute called MEMIAC. She later shared that after she sent that announcement, she was informed that she wasn't supposed to send out announcements to the whole community in that manner, but it was a great moment for me. It seemed like a sign that my research was going to be a success, that I was actually going to get through it. And she and I formed a very good friendship, and she also helped and encouraged me at every step of the way, including persuading me to expand the scope of the research. I originally, in the dissertation, only took the story up to 1955. Ani told me that I ought to bring it up to 1965. I found that brought me into the 70s. And then my publisher asked me to give it a subtitle that just said, "In the 20th Century." So now for Truth in Advertising, I felt that I had to add even more material. And for that reason, it does go up through the year 2000 and even a little bit beyond. Now, one thing that we're very much aware of in the present era is that a population group can live, a national population group can live in a very divided sphere, in very divided spheres based on what outlets they get their news from. I think we're all aware that here in the United States, people who get their news from Fox and people who get their news from MSNBC are living in two different planes of reality. And so it was that through the 20th century, when the opposing political parties dominated the Armenian press, readers of the Hyrenic press, that is the press of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation or Tashnag Party, were getting a completely different narrative from readers of the Baikar press. Now, to be a little more precise, there was the ARF or Tashnag Party, and there was the non-Tashnag or anti-Tashnag coalition, but the Ramgavar Party always seemed to be at the forefront of that coalition, as evidenced by the fact that the attacks in Hyrenic always seemed to be against the Ramgavar press. So, for purposes of convenience, I'm letting the Ramgavars, for the most part, speak for the non-Tashnag coalition. And indeed, these were the papers through much of the century. From early in the century, there were the daily Armenian language papers. Actually, Baikar came on the scene in the 1920s. Before that, there was OSK on the non-Tashnag side. And from the Tashnags, there was always Hyrenic. And in the 1930s, as the second generation of genocide survivors and genocide-era immigrants came of age, there were now the English language papers, Hyrenic Weekly and the Armenian Mirror, which merged into the Armenian Spectator at the end of the 1930s. But in any event, my big point is that the partisan press always played a big part in shaping the narratives that members of the Armenian community lived in. Now, on the eve of World War I, there wasn't an independent country called Armenia. There was an Armenian population in the eastern provinces of Turkey, and there was an Armenian population on the Caucasus of the Russian Empire. So that of course, put them in a very dangerous position when Russia and Turkey were at war against each other in the fall of 1914. Because indeed, World War I started in Europe in August of 1914. Turkey entered the war on the side of Germany in November of 1914 and proceeded to attack Russia. They were beaten back by Russian forces in January and February of 1915. The Turkish government, the Ottoman government, scapegoated the Armenians, and from there the extermination campaign, known in the more modern era as the genocide, got going in April of 1915. Now, in May of 1918, Armenia, along with the two other nationalities on the Caucasus, the Georgians and the Azeris, Armenia formed an independent republic. I mean, to put that into a little bit of context, it needs to be remembered that in the spring of 1917, the Tsarist government of Russia was overthrown. There was a social democratic regime that lasted for about 6 months, and then in the fall of 1917, the Bolsheviks, or communists, overthrew that government, but it took them a couple of years to get around to Armenia. So the Armenians in 1918 were able to form an independent republic, and that republic was dominated by the ARF, the Tashnag party. Now, the whole time that the Republic was in existence, the newspapers were totally different in the way that they depicted it. That is to say, the Hieronic press, the Tashnag or ARF press, depicted the Republic as the embodiment of Armenia. They depicted the Republic as Armenia and gave it full support and praise. So readers of Hieronic understood the Republic to be Armenia. Readers of the non-Tashnag press, especially ASK, which was published by what at that time was called the Constitutional Ramgavar Party, got a very different story. For non-Tashnags, the future of Armenia was and ought to be in the hands of the Armenian national delegation, which the Catholicos at Echmiadzin had dispatched to Paris even before the First World War began, headed by the wealthy Egyptian Armenian named Boghos Nubar Pasha. From the point of view of non-Tashnags, Boghos Nubar Pasha and his delegation represented the future of Armenia. So the non-Tashnag press rarely mentioned the Republic, and when they did mention the Republic, it was not favorably. Now, an interesting point, an interesting observation that I've made is that even while the conflicting Armenian parties were calling each other all kinds of nasty names in their newspaper editorials in the Armenian language, they spoke with one voice to the rest of the world, to the point that you had to know how to read Armenian to be aware of the partisan conflict, because you could say the Armenian language was the secret code for the infighting. When they spoke to world leaders, when they spoke to American politicians and the leaders of the great powers, they gave the appearance of speaking with one voice. An illustration of that comes in the two different orations that the peacemakers at the Paris conference in the first half of 1919 heard. Remember, the Great War ended in the fall of 1918, and for the first half of 1919, delegations from the victorious powers were assembled at Paris to redraw the map, and delegates from every conceivable nationality around the world converged on Paris to advocate for their homeland. Now, at the Paris conference, the delegates heard from two different Armenian spokesmen. Avedis Aharonian represented the Republic, and Boghos Nubar Pasha was there for the Armenian national delegation. But from the point of view of their listeners, they didn't seem to be representing conflicting ideologies. They merely appeared to be representing two different halves of Armenia. Boghos Nubar Pasha was perceived as representing Western Armenia, that is, the eastern provinces of the Ottoman Empire, and Avedis Aharonian was seen as representing the eastern portion of the historic homeland. But if you look closely at their words, you can see where they differed. Aharonian said, the Caucasian Armenians, that is, the Armenians in the Republic, the Caucasian Armenians ardently desire reunion of the Republic with the Armenian provinces of Turkey. Now, Boghos Nubar Pasha might, on the surface, have seemed to be saying the same thing, but note his wording. He says, "Our claim is that independent Armenia should comprise all Armenian territory and should be formed of, first, Cilicia, with Sanjak of Marash, the 6 vilayets of Erzurum, Bitlis, Van, Diyarbakir, Karput, Sivas, and a portion of the vilayet of Trebizond, giving access to the Black Sea, and," take notice of the wording here, "the territory of the Armenian Republic of the Caucasus, the population of which demands union with its brothers in Turkey under one single Armenian state." You notice how he's finessing it so that he's not committing himself to recognizing the legitimacy of the republic in its own right. And a little later in the speech, he said, referring to Armenians, "They are quite capable of governing themselves when the time comes for them to set up an independent state," as if there were not an independent state there already. But the Armenians, including these two, they did share a consensus that they wanted an independent state that consisted of a combination of Ottoman territory and Armenian territory in the former Russian Empire. Now, this is Woodrow Wilson and the map that he had drawn of Armenia, because what happened there was that at the Paris Peace Conference, the other powers asked Wilson to please stake out an opinion on what the rightful territory of Armenia ought to be, which he agreed to do. Now, obviously, it wasn't Wilson himself who did the map drawing. Wilson himself suffered a debilitating stroke in the fall of that same year when he was touring the country trying to drum up support for the League of Nations, which was his first pride and joy. He did mention Armenia in some of those speeches, but his real first love was bringing about the League of Nations, which the United States ended up not joining. But Wilson did put forward a map, but by the time he did, the whole idea, the whole venture of an independent Armenia was already in the process of falling through. Now, I want to make an important point. The feuding between the factions was constant. The feuding between the factions was constant. It was in the editorial pages of the papers all the time. As a matter of fact, there was one point when Congress, early on in America's participation in the war, Congress was considering passing legislation imposing punishments on American newspapers for failing to print favorable reportage on the American war effort. This didn't pass, but both of the Armenian partisan papers that I referred to, Osk and Hyrenik, responded to this by lamenting that it was too bad that there wasn't any force of law that could stop rogue Armenian presses from publishing material damaging to the Armenian cause, and what they were talking about was each other. And yet, I want to make an emphatic point. It would be a mistake to think that the feuding between the Armenian factions was responsible for the loss of Armenian control over their homeland. It would be a mistake to think that the Armenians lost out on controlling the future of their homeland by quarreling over it, because the fact of the matter is that the fate of the Armenian ancestral homeland was in the hands of non-Armenians. And the Armenians, when push came to shove, simply didn't have the political capital to withstand it. They had been given reason to think that they were going to get favorable outcomes from the peace conferences. It should be noted that during the war, Britain and France asked Armenian leaders, especially Boghos Nubar Pasha, to organize a volunteer force that would help with the incursion into the Ottoman Empire that Britain and France made in 1918. Now, I think a lot of us are aware that the current conflict in the Middle East has its roots in the conflicting promises that British and French diplomats made to Jews and Arabs during the same period of time. Two particular gentlemen, Sykes and Picot, promised the moon and the stars to Jews and Arabs in order to have both their help in that incursion into the Ottoman Empire. Just want to note, what's lesser known is that Sykes and Picot also promised the moon and the stars to the Armenians and pulled out. They reneged on those promises. The victorious Allies were also very slow in imposing any punitive constraints on Turkey. I think it's well known that the Versailles Treaty imposed extremely harsh punitive measures against Germany. But in the case of Turkey, with the delay, they made it possible for the new nationalist movement led by Mustafa Kemal, or Ataturk, to rise. We take notice of the Treaty of Sèvres. The Treaty of Sèvres in August of 1920 required Turkey to abide by whatever borders of Armenia Woodrow Wilson was going to draw up. But the Treaty of Sèvres simply didn't hold up. In December of 1920, the Armenian Republic collapsed. And the end of November 1920 and into December of 1920, as the Turks moved in on Armenia from one side and the Soviet forces moved in from the other side, and Armenia, the Republic of Armenia, because it had no choice, surrendered to the Soviet troops in order to maintain as Soviet Armenia what the portion that the Turks had not taken over. And then came the Treaty of Lausanne in July of 1923. Actually, first let me note that another part of the problem was that in the spring of 1919, the European allies, the European victorious allies, encouraged Greece to attack Turkey. But as that war got going, Britain and France lost interest. They soured on Greece after there was a regime change in Greece. So what Britain and France actually did there was gave Turkey a new war and let Turkey win it. And that was what led to the genocidal massacres of Armenians and Greeks in Smyrna in 1922. Okay, now, the Treaty of Lausanne. First the treaty that the European powers signed with Lausanne, and then the treaty that the United States entered into but did not ratify. The Lausanne treaties obligated Turkey to respect the integrity of foreign businesses, foreign educational institutions, foreign religious institutions, and the rights of minorities. But there was no enforcement power, so Turkey did not end up suffering any great punitive sanctions for the extermination campaign against Armenians. that would come to be called the genocide. The word genocide wasn't in the language yet. But again, the partisan feud wasn't responsible for any of this, but the partisan feud is still important to understanding the dynamics of community life here in the United States and elsewhere in the diaspora, because the point there is the perceptions. Now, all through the 1920s, readers of the conflicting partisan press had the contested memories rehearsed. Hyrenik was regularly reminding readers of the glories of the Republic, the glories of the thousand-day Republic. Readers of the Ramgavar press, and now the Ramgavar press was Baikar. Readers of the Ramgavar press rarely saw the Republic mentioned at all, and when it was mentioned, it was not favorably so. Oh, with reference to Lausanne, this quotation just gives you an example of the lack of political capital that Armenians had in the aftermath of the Great War. Joseph C. Grew was the U.S. delegate. He was at all of the Lausanne negotiations before the United States was formally a party to them. The Armenian national home was just one idea that had been floated that represented a degree of self-determination for Armenians within the Ottoman Empire. It was a scheme that non-Tashnags favored, that Tashnags were against, but all that was moot because it didn't have a chance of getting off the ground anyway. Joseph Grew made this entry in his journal, January 9th of 1923. It has not been determined whether it is wise to present only clauses upon which the Allies intend to insist, or to include matters such as the national Armenian home upon which they will give way. Now, after the collapse of the Republic, and this is really fundamental to understanding multiple aspects of Armenian community partisan life in the decades that followed, the non-Tashnag coalition, and here we're talking about the Ramgavar Party, the Hunchak Party, and the Armenian Progressive League, which was openly Bolshevik. The non-Tashnag coalition, for their different reasons, accepted Soviet rule over Eastern Armenia and pursued friendly relations with the Soviet government. And that meant giving favorable depictions of Armenian life under Soviet rule, occasionally expressing concern about Soviet actions, occasionally criticizing the Soviet government for oppressive actions, but for the most part, maintaining friendly relations. The Tashnag Party maintained a position of resistance to the Soviet state and regularly published horror stories of life under communist rule. Now, this is a bit paradoxical because it's not that the Tashnags actually wanted the Soviets to pull out. The Tashnags would be the first to admit that if the Soviets were to just withdraw from Armenia tomorrow, that Armenians would now be vulnerable to further massacres by Turks. But they still maintained a position of hostility to the Soviet state. And as I already mentioned, the contested memories of the Republic years and the ongoing finger-pointing, they dominated the pages of the partisan press. So, as I say, the role of the press, it gave constant reminders to readers of those contested memories. In the Tashnag press, Hyrenic, the memory of the Republic was a big deal. The Ramgavar press, Baikar, rarely mentioned the Republic, and not favorably. Now, for the first couple of years of the next decade, the 1930s, it actually appeared as if the partisan feud might be dying down, because already the papers were starting to take on a new focus of indignation against Turkey and against the international community's overly friendly behavior toward Turkey. So during those first few years of the decade, when the partisan press took swipes at each other, it wasn't nearly as often. But all of that changed with the Turian affair in 1933. Now, what happened there was that Archbishop Levon Turian, the primate of the Eastern Armenian Apostolic Church of America, was to make an appearance at the Century of Progress exposition in Chicago on the stage of the Armenian Pavilion. When he got there, he saw that the tricolor, the flag of the Armenian Thousand Days Republic, was up there. Archbishop Turian's position, in line with the position of the Catholicos at Echmiadzin, was to keep friendly with the Soviet Armenian government, and the tricolor, the flag of the Republic, was just inconsistent with that position. So Archbishop Turian ordered the removal of that flag. Now, it's got to be understood, the gathering there consisted of both Tashnags and non-Tashnags. To Tashnags, this was the worst possible national insult, because to Tashnags, that flag was the symbol of Armenia. To non-Tashnags, that flag was no big deal, and Archbishop Turian himself was the sacred symbol of the essence of Armenia. Fistfights broke out, chairs were thrown, Archbishop Turian got death threats and was attacked physically at a church picnic later in the year. And then on December 24th of 1933, while presiding over a ritual of divine liturgy at the Holy Cross Armenian Church in Washington Heights, New York, Archbishop Turian was assassinated. A group of men surrounded him and stabbed him. He fell dead on the floor. Within a week, 9 members of the ARF, the Tashnag party, had been arrested, and their trial ensued over the next few months. Readers of the partisan presses were getting conflicting stories of that trial. To readers of Hyrenic, Archbishop Turian was a traitor to his nation, or, to use the common lingo of the time, a traitor to his race. To non-Tashnags, the Tashnag party was responsible for the assassination. See, the Tashnags considered those 9 men to be innocent scapegoats. To the anti-Tashnags, not only those 9 men, but the Tashnag party at large were responsible for this heinous fratricidal crime. So the animosity in the community now reached a high level of intensity, and church congregations started dividing. There were now police incidents, as one set of congregants in a church would lock another set out. And pretty soon, there were Tashnag congregations and non-Tashnag congregations in the Armenian Apostolic Church. But But I made another observation on all of this, and that is that I found that there was an interconnection between the opposing views of the status of the homeland, the opposing approaches, the opposing responses to Soviet Armenia, to Soviet control over Armenia, and what I call the how to be an ethnic group question. The 1930s was a decade in which both the Tashnags and the Ramgavars founded youth organizations. The Tashnag Party founded Segagron, which was later renamed the Armenian Youth Federation. The Ramgavar Party created ADL Youth, and both of those parties, which right along had been publishing Armenian language daily papers, began publishing English language weeklies, which were mainly geared to the American-born generation, which in large numbers did not speak Armenian. Now, the connection between feelings about the homeland and the how to be an ethnic group question involved the fact that the Ramgavars had a homeland that was under temporary protective guardianship, while the Tashnags had a homeland that was under enemy occupation, which means that while both parties were highly interested in both the past and the future of Armenia, it was the Tashnags and not the Ramgavars who felt a sense of struggle over the current status of Armenia. The Ramgavars took it as a given that there would eventually be an independent Armenia, but they were not complaining about the current status. Even while, as I keep mentioning, the paradox of the Tashnag position was that even the Tashnags admitted that it would be a disaster if the Soviets were to pull out at that time. But Tashnags wanted their members to be in a constant state of demanding an independent Armenia. So we're talking sense of identity. We're talking conflicting sense of identity in relation to how they viewed their homeland. Now, this reflected in the founding of the youth groups. Segagron was founded amid a national tour by General Karakin Nejde, who had held a high position in the Republic. He published an essay in Hieronyk in which he called for, quote, racial patriotism, for, quote, devotional worship of the majestic past of our race, and the natural and logical reaction against the foreign environment which is threatening the very existence of our race. He said that youth members must, quote, live and act as the warriors of the race wherever they may be, and whatever social rank they may command outside of Armenia. A youth member was to be one who demands a free and independent Armenia, master of a strong will, manly and courageous, because the coward and the timorous cannot become standard bearers of racial aspirations. And one Gregory Torosian wrote in Hieronyk Weekly, in view of the existence of anti-national elements within our people, and that refers to all members of the anti-Tashnag coalition, the Ramgavars, the Hunchaks, the Armenian Progressive League, and others of anti-Tashnag persuasion. In view of the existence of the anti-national elements within our people, the national spirit of our new generation must be so developed that it easily manifests itself with constructive aggressiveness to meet the destructive arrogance of the anti-national elements, be they organized groups or individuals. And in that same piece, he opined that Sega-grown males should learn boxing. He wrote, "As sport, boxing is a brutal amusement, but as a means of defense, boxing should be taught to our boys as a necessity," which makes one wonder whether what he was implying was that Sega-grown boys should be engaging in fistfights with young males of the anti-national elements. And it should come as no surprise, since it was the Tashnags who felt a sense of struggle over their race, that it was the Tashnag paper, the Hieronyk Weekly, that ran a survey on whether Armenian mixed marriages were a good or a bad thing. Now, it should not be assumed that everybody who responded thought they were a bad thing, but whether they thought Armenian mixed marriages were a good thing or not, there was that sense of racial distinctiveness either way. One who identified as Deverish wrote, "I am opposed to mixed marriages because the other party is a stranger to us in disposition, traditions, in physical harmony, in domestic mode of life, in food, in religion, in moral conception, and lastly, in quality of love. I am convinced that many non-Armenian girls who have married Armenian boys have sincerely tried to make them happy, but they have not succeeded because clay will never change. The Armenian is Armenian and will die an Armenian. Permit me to say that all Armenians who have married outside the pale of their race and who protest vociferously how happy they are not telling the truth." But B.M. Khachadurian had a whole other take. And note the racialist language here. And by racialist, I simply mean the idea of Armenians being a race with particular traits in their blood. B.M. Khachadurian wrote, "For thousands of years, we have kept practically free the Armenian blood that flows in our veins. Certainly no people has done more to keep its strain clear of other people. Has it improved our race? Has it made us any stronger? Have our men become better fighters? Have our girls become better mothers? I should answer flatly, no. We are suspended in a midway position. We are not strong enough to win, and we are not weak enough to die. If we continue this way, we shall die as individuals and as a people. What we need is new blood brought in from other races. These new elements might spoil our stock, yet they might improve it." Now, during these same years, the Ramgavar press also depicted Armenians as having special virtues. The Ramgavar press also cared about keeping Armenian identity alive. And obviously, that's the whole purpose of these youth organizations, both Sega-grown and ADL, keeping Armenian identity alive, and also keeping these particular institutions, these particular parties alive. And the Ramgavar press also cared about the future of the homeland. But what was absent there was the sense of a struggle. Certainly the absence of a sense of the struggle over the homeland in the present. On the launching of the Armenian Mirror, the editors wrote, in talking about future young generations, the offspring of the current young generation, quote, "It is they who are to supply Armenia with architects, mechanics, engineers, intellects, and artists tomorrow." And note, by the way, that my chapter on the party's outreach to the youth is titled, "To Supply Armenia with Architects." Now, both parties, through their youth organizations, ran dances and athletic tournaments to keep young Armenians forming friendships and romances with each other, so that their offspring could supply the future Armenia with architects and other such specialists. But in the Ramgavar outreach, the sense of a great cosmic struggle was absent. Now, one thing that I do in the book is suggest a terminology for these conflicting styles of ethnicity. And I just happened to have run across a 1982 article, actually this article was a piece of a book by Peter Benson and Dorothy L. Williams. They were talking about the religious behavior of members of Congress, but they put forward the terms challenge religion and comfort religion, where challenge religion is faith-centered on obligation to act and obligation to believe specific rigid doctrines, while comfort religion is faith with a more flexible, even elective quality, centered on the salutary assurance of God's love and care. I actually find it puzzling that I haven't been able to find these terms in use by sociologists beyond these two, but this particular book was of a more religious prescriptive nature. But be that as it may, I find an analogy between these terms about religious practice and a pair of terms that I've coined about styles of ethnicity with reference to the Armenians: militant ethnicity versus celebratory ethnicity, where obviously it was the ARF, the Tashnags, who represented militant ethnicity, calling for members of the group to feel a sense of struggle and to be in conformity with some very specific tenets of belief, with very specific opinions. Remember, again, it was the Tashnags who said that a member of the youth group must be one who demands a free and independent Armenia. Celebratory ethnicity, more emphasis on the joys and benefits of being Armenian, and not so much a sense of obligation to think anything specific or do anything specific. But I've got to emphasize the different Armenian factions totally agreed that Armenians had special intrinsic virtues that combined the best of the Eastern and Western worlds. They totally agreed that changes in cultural norms were inevitable and in large part desirable. The leaders in either political faction were not trying to preserve old world ways of life, such as arranged marriages. Although, I got to make a side note on that. Obviously, there were some elders who did. In the early 50s, there was an ad in the Armenian Mirror Spectator. A man looking for young Armenian girls to correspond with on the subject of, quote, matrimony for my American-born grandson. And a week later, another man wrote in and expressed an interest in what response the first man had gotten and whether he'd be willing to share a few of the responses that he got. Now, there isn't any record of how much the grandsons appreciated their grandfather's efforts at finding them Armenian mates, but it does show that there were members of the older generation who did want to preserve institutions like arranged marriage, but it was generally understood that old world institutions such as arranged marriages weren't going to be viable here. But it should also be noted that these youth groups certainly liked the idea of Armenians meeting and forming friendships and romances and marriages through the course of attending dances and athletic tournaments and such. The different Armenian factions further agreed that the Armenian youth should maintain their sense of Armenianness and their attachment to the ancestral homeland. And they also agreed that Armenians of all generations in the United States should be loyal, patriotic Americans. And they encouraged achievement in the American mainstream. The presses regularly celebrated when an Armenian high school student became editor of the yearbook. They showed pictures of Armenian graduates. So upward mobility within the American mainstream was fully encouraged by the different Armenian partisan factions. Now, apart from the partisan conflict, I found some entertaining stuff in the presses, especially in the 1930s. I found that the editorial pages and the letters to the editor pages constituted a virtual village square. I mean, today we have that on the internet. Back in the 1930s, it was on editorial pages of Hieronyk Weekly and the Armenian Mirror, where you find young people, young Armenian male and female youth, complaining about each other's behavior and navigating their place amid as an immigrant group amid the American cultural mainstream. There was a series of pieces on the question of whether the older generation was being too traditional. One who identified as the New Yorker in Hieronyk Weekly wrote in 1938 that when a young Armenian male takes out an Armenian girl, quote, his family tree falls subject to investigation under a third-degree assault of interrogatives, and if his status proves satisfactory, the daughter is permitted to accompany him. Still, there's a catch to it. She must be back at a puritanical hour, and even though the boy and girl realize with sinking heart the unfairness of the ultimatum, both are willing to acquiesce for the sake of avoiding an argument which may jeopardize their chances for the evening. Thus becomes self-evident another reason why an Armenian boy will not take out an Armenian girl. He must also take her back home and face the music. What a sad commentary that a race with our potentialities should remain supinely fettered by the habits, customs, and belief of an outmoded ancestry. And this drew a response from Artaki Berberian of Providence, Rhode Island. The New Yorker gives us the wrong impression when he claims that it is difficult to date an Armenian girl. If the youth enjoys a good reputation, and I want to emphasize the word reputation, he has a very good chance to take out an Armenian girl. But we must not forget that we, as civilized people, adhere to certain indefinite customs. I do admit that there are many backwoodsman type of Armenian parents, but then let us not forget that in the old country, conventions and customs were altogether different from those of America. We can't expect these parents to grasp new conventions overnight. Which shows a consensus that cultural change was desirable in the new environment, but that traditions still had their place. And in the same conversation, Cetric Minus, who was the secretary of the Armenian youth, the Tashnag youth organization, wrote, it was natural for the parents to feel apprehensive about the retention of their racial identity, and this fear normally led to the frame of mind that if racial identity was to be retained, all racial habits and customs must be retained. With practically no guidance, our youth attempted to reconcile the two modes of life. Instead of meeting around the conference table, the youth and the parents aligned themselves in separate warring camps. Impasse is the present result. But Minos also criticized the youth for going too far in accepting vulgar modern forms, including cheek-to-cheek dancing. Now, in 1934, there was a series of letters in the Armenian Mirror, the Ramgavar paper, over whether Armenian boys and girls were modern enough for each other, with American youth as the constant frame of reference. Albert Shakarian wrote, "If our girls would only, besides copying the ordinary mannerisms of the so-called Americans, who are such in name only, cultivate a little sophistication and add a little grace to their carriage, acquire a little taste, simple yet effective, in their dress, they could easily have things their own way." The following week, one who identified as Elsie wrote, "Most of our Armenian boys wouldn't know the difference between a Paris creation and a Filene 395. I cannot recall ever seeing an Armenian fellow that was tall, well-mannered, and good-looking. Most of them have been about 5 feet tall, dark and homely, and still they think they do the girls a big favor when they talk with them. Let all Armenian boys take a good look in the mirror before deciding to pick the opposite sex apart." And S.R. of Worcester, identifying as a staunch defender of the Armenian girl, wrote, "Armenian girls don't spend as much time and money as our American sisters, forever dolling up like Easter bunnies. Fine birds don't need fine feathers. It is quite right that our girls don't carry themselves as Americans do, but why say they can't? Isn't it all a matter of time? Armenian ethnics, customs, mannerisms, and ideas weren't built overnight and cannot be changed so quickly as the shake of a lamb's tail. The Armenian girl realizes her shortcomings, and that is far more than the boys have done. Masculine conceit, you know." And Nemmer S. of West New York, New Jersey, wrote in and said, "Perhaps the Armenian boys do not have that nonchalance that American boys possess, but upon what comparisons do our girls base their judgment? Do they compare us with Barrymores, William Powells, Leslie Howards? We can't very well be actors. A more logical plane of comparison can be made with similar groups of a single nationality. Does a group of Italians, Germans, or Jews show more nonchalance than we Armenian boys do?" And inherent in all of this, you find the sense of identity as a culture that blends the East and the West, and that is in a process of transition, a process of acculturation, a process of finding themselves as a national group within a larger national group, and some self-deprecating humor was evident. For example, I found a gem of a letter in which, right after a New Year's dance, a girl complained that at this New Year's dance, the music was too American and the efficiency level of the ladies' cloakroom was too Armenian. Now, the Cold War gave the Tashnags a golden opportunity to make their whole ideology synonymous not only with being a good Armenian, but being a good American, and thus an opportunity to call their Armenian opponents not only bad Armenians, but also bad Americans. Because once the Cold War got going, the Tashnags intensified their sense of struggle against Armenian control of Soviet control, against Soviet control of Armenia, and formed coalitions with other national groups, especially Poles and Ukrainians, to resist Soviet control of of their homelands. Although when I say they formed coalitions, when I say that the Tashnag party formed coalitions, I just have to note that it's only in the Tashnag Armenian press that I find evidence of this. I'm not able to find how much attention got paid to them by other members of the coalitions, the Polish and Ukrainian leaders. The Tashnags branded the Ramgavar press as pro-Soviet, but made a big point of never calling them communist. And I talked with a former editor in the Hyrenic press, James Tastian, when he was still alive, and he told me that his boss, Mandalian, had strictly instructed them, we're not calling them communists. We are calling them pro-Soviet, but we're not calling them communists. And when the US government undertook a psychological strategy to destabilize the Soviet state through its intelligence forces, most of which was not known to the general public, but the Armenian Tashnags did lend their rhetorical support to it. The term psychological strategy shows up in Tashnag editorials. And during these Cold War years, the Tashnags didn't just celebrate May 28th, the anniversary of the founding of the Republic. They also celebrated February 19th, the anniversary of a 1921 anti-Soviet uprising in Armenia after the Soviet control had been established. The Ramgavars, meanwhile, took part in celebrations of the anniversary of the Soviet state, blaming the Tashnags for the inadequacies of the republic that preceded it. The anniversary of the founding of the Soviet state, November 2nd, 1920, which the Armenian National Council of America, 1952, that's Charles Vertanus's organization, called the Emancipation of Armenia from Tyranny, Insecurity, and the Threat of Annihilation. Now, the church split was formalized in 1956 after a Tashnag-leaning Catholicos, Zare, was consecrated in Antelius. Now, there was the formal break of the Tashnag-leaning churches with Echmiadzin, the creation of the pro-Tashnag prelacy in Boston in 1958, which later moved to Manhattan. And since then, each congregation, as is well known, each congregation of the Armenian Apostolic Church has been affiliated with either the diocese, which is non-Tashnag, or the prelacy, which is Tashnag aligned. Now, I want to quickly mention in passing that there's a section in my book dealing with what I found in government files on a General Duro, or Drastamat Ganayan. General Duro held a position in the government of the Republic, and it was also known that during World War II, he made a pact with the Nazi regime in Germany. The Tashnags and the anti-Tashnags had sharply contrasting interpretations of that. From the anti-Tashnag point of view, this showed that General Duro was pro-Nazi. From the Tashnag point of view, it was a survivalist tactic to save the lives of thousands of Armenians who were in Germany. And I do find credibility that his actions saved some Armenian lives in Germany. In any event, though, after the war, there was a secret association between General Duro and some officers of the CIA, where they were making plans for Armenian volunteers to be involved in possible military action against the Soviet Union based in Iran, where General Duro was promising that he could provide 2,000 Armenian volunteers and a handful of Tashnag party members who were trained in sabotage, and in exchange for that, he wanted armaments for the Tashnag party. Now, I don't get the impression that anything besides talk came out of this. I get the impression from looking through the files that the CIA officers and General Duro made each other all kinds of grandiose promises. In any event, though, Duro died in 1956. The Tashnags mourned his death, but it was only Tashnag Armenians who mourned the death of General Duro. Now, my own take on the partisan division, at least one component of the partisan division. I'm not claiming that this is the whole thing, but I do find that there was a symbiotic marketing relationship between the party leadership and the general Armenian constituency, which included, but not limited, was not limited to the relationship between the partisan newspaper editors and the readers of the partisan press. I'm finding that the parties were so integral to Armenian community life that for each faction, loyalty to the partisan vision was central to the sense of Armenianness. I find that the parties were marketing their activities, their ideological visions, and their newspapers to their constituents, and that their constituents were regularly expecting to be updated on the latest acts of treachery and bad faith of the leaders of the opposing side. I found that Varujan Samuelian, the editor in the 1950s of the Mirror Spectator, really raised the anti-Tashnag rhetoric to an art form. And to the point that at the start of the 1960s, the question seems to have been, could the partisan animosity die down without bringing Armenian identity down with it? Because again, Armenian identity was so tightly intertwined with one's position in the Tashnag, anti-Tashnag feud. Now, what was clearly happening in the 1960s was that the genocide, with the use of the word genocide, was coming into focus. Now, the word genocide was originally coined in 1943 by a Jewish legal scholar named Raphael Lemkin, and obviously coined it in the context of the Nazi Holocaust of the Jewish population. And from early on, the Turkish extermination campaign against Armenians was being referred to as an example of what was meant by the word genocide. It took a while longer for the term the genocide to actually catch on as the formal name of what happened in 1915, and took even longer for Armenians to start insisting that one must use that word and exclusively use that word in order to be telling the truth. Now, from early on in the life of the UN, there was a document called the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Ironically, while the United States pushed for it in its initial stages, it wasn't ratified until 1988. And a huge part of the reason why there wasn't any chance that it was going to get ratified much sooner than that was that many in the Senate, because you realize a treaty needs a 2/3 vote in the Senate to ratify it, many in the Senate, especially in the South, feared that the Genocide Convention could be used against the United States for the treatment of the African American population, especially because one of the definitions, one of the clauses in the definition of genocide was, quote, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. So, and meanwhile, in the rest of the world, there were many who were anxious for the United States to ratify the Genocide Convention because they mistakenly thought that it was going to give the United States a special police role in enforcing it. Now, but in the 1960s and the 1970s, there was a rise in the focus of indignation on the subject of the genocide, and also indignation against favorable treatment of Turkey by the international community, indignation against U.S. aid to Turkey, indignation against a push for countries to have commemorative stamps for Ataturk, which to Armenians as well as Greeks would make as much sense as having commemorative stamps to honor Hitler. But note the publication in 1971 of Marjorie Hosepian's book, The Smyrna Affair, which was about the later set of genocidal massacres in Smyrna in 1922, an extension of the genocide. Dikron Boyajian's book, Armenia, The Case for a Forgotten Genocide in 1972, and the founding of the Armenian Assembly of America, which was a group dedicated to pushing for recognition of the Armenian genocide and treatment of Turkey accordingly. Now, there was a decline in partisanism in the 1960s and 1970s. Or, to put it another way, there was an easing up of the tensions between Tashnag and anti-Tashnag in the 60s and 70s. Now, this wasn't clear at the start of the 1960s. At the start of the 1960s, the newspaper editorials were flying fast and furious against each other. But in 1965, the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the genocide, the three major political parties worldwide issued a statement saying, let's take a break from fighting each other as we observe this commemoration. They didn't hold joint commemorations in 1965. The churches and the parties still held separate commemorations, but there was a pause in the fiery partisan rhetoric. Meanwhile, there were some other factors. I've already mentioned the rise in the shared focus of indignation against Turkey and against the international community's friendly gestures to Turkey. And there was also, from the late 1960s onward, a new line of division, conflicts over authenticity between old-line Armenian-Americans and new Armenian immigrants coming in from Turkey, Soviet Armenia, Iran, Lebanon, and other countries. One immigrant in Watertown in 1978 complained about the old-line Armenians, quote, "Most of them don't know our language, and to me that means they can't call themselves Armenians." And one of the effects of this shift, one of the effects of this influx was that in Watertown, there was St. Stephen's Church, which was affiliated with the prelacy, and thus it was Tashnag dominated. As it began filling up with new immigrants from Syria and Lebanon, a number of parishioners from that church started going to St. James Church, which was diocese affiliated, that is, non-Tashnag, which meant that for those who made the move, cultural similarity mattered more to them than partisan affiliation. And there was a resolution at the ARF's 20th World Congress in Vienna in 1972, shifting the primary focus of enmity from the Soviet state to Turkey. And the rise of a nonpartisan press, especially the Armenian Reporter. If I could draw, I've got the perfect cartoon for the effect of the rise of the Armenian Reporter, the nonpartisan Armenian Reporter. This cartoon would show the Mirror Spectator and Hieronyk Weekly as two angry dogs barking fiercely at each other. The second frame would show the Armenian Reporter as a dog showing up in the yard, and now the other two dogs start barking at the Armenian Reporter. And one rather curious phenomenon that we find in the 1970s is defenses of, quote, the Armenian political parties. I'm talking editorial pieces and letters to the editor using that phrase, the Armenian political parties, and defending their existence as a good thing, which is very different from past pieces defending the rightness of this or that Armenian political party. And in 1975, the churches still held separate genocide commemorations, but the three political parties, Ramgavar, Hunchag, and Tashnag, ran an unprecedented joint commemoration, which was also a protest against ongoing human rights violations by Turkey and against Turkey's continued denial of the genocide. The Tashnags, Ramgavars, and Hunchaks marched in concert from 26th Street and Madison Avenue in New York City to UN headquarters and presented a petition addressed to the UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim. His own complicity in another genocide was not yet out in the open. Now, just some closing reflections. I'm really glad to hear that there's been an increase in the amount of research being done on Armenian-American life, because there certainly needs to be more. My book is, I hope, a contribution, but there's still much more to be done. So I'm glad to hear that more is being done. And to that end, there needs to be more archival materials donated to libraries such as NAASR. And as I mentioned earlier, you get the sense from walking around this building that NAASR is here to stay for a very long time, and that it's got the capacity to absorb more diaries and correspondence files and other memorabilia. And if you've got such materials in your possession, you have no way of knowing what's historically significant and what isn't. So it's best to assume that what you have is historically significant. There need to be translations of classic Armenian works, more translations of classic Armenian works. I'm aware, and I don't have specifics on it, but I'm generally aware that there exists a multi-volume work of anthropological observation on Western Armenians from the late 19th century. It's in Armenian. It ought to be translated into English, another language. What I have attempted to do in my book, and more needs to be done, is integration of Armenian experiences into general American immigrant history, general American diplomatic history, the field of international relations. It's almost true that a book is only likely to have the word Armenian in its index if it has the word Armenian in its title. I'd like to see that change. And there needs to be continued encouragement of Armenian-related arts, the theater, literature, etc. There's a play running off-Broadway in New York City, which I was going to see and then couldn't, but hope I can still see it before it closes, called Meet the Cartosians. Now, from what I understand of it, Act 1 takes place in the 1920s and involves a case, a naturalization case of one Mr. Cartosian, which I talk about in my book. And by the way, there's loads more in my book than what I've talked about here. What I've presented here is just a little sampling. And the totality of what's in my book is just a little sampling of what needs to be done. Oh, anyway, though, Act 1 of Meet the Cartosians deals with that 1927 case. And from what I understand, Act 2 shows modern-day descendants of the Cartosians who are depicted as mirroring the Kardashians in a reality show. Anyway, like to open up to conversation, and conversation is exactly what I like to call it. For any questions, I may or may not have the answers, and I've got my book ready to refer to, because at this point my book knows more than I do. And I also encourage people to respond to each other's questions if you've got the answers, or raise any points of discussion you like.
But first, clap.
Yes.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for covering a lot of ground, and indeed, it's definitely not everything. There's a lot more in the book for sure, and we encourage you pick up a copy. I also forgot to mention at the beginning.
Oh my God, it's 9 o'clock already. This talk is too long.
You didn't miss your train, did you?
No.
Okay,
No,
very good. All right.
But I'm giving it again tomorrow night, and I can see that I'm probably going to need to pare it down a little. But thank you for holding up your attention. You've been a very attentive audience.
If you have questions here, please come up to the microphone. There is a question from online that I wanted to ask you. In your opinion, and based on what, I don't know how closely you follow community affairs in real time, but how present still are the Cold War divisions in today's U.S. diaspora? And do you consider it ironic, or do you consider it accurate that there has been a recent reversal of roles, i.e. the previously anti-Soviet Tashnag party is now in many ways pro-Russia, while the Ramgavars are largely pro-West?
I would guess that there are people here in the live audience who can respond to that a whole lot better than I can. So I simply want to say that I invite it, because I don't claim any expertise on any aspect of what's going on now, being a historian.
Fair enough. And I wanted to ask a question as well about the sort of racial usage that you describe and quote in some of the 30s writings. Did you find that terminology, which I think was pretty common in that time period generally, was used by in both presses, in the Ramgavar as well as in the Tashnag press?
Oh, yes. They used the word race to mean nationality
or ethnicity,
or
yeah.
ethnic group, but they did believe that that in a nationality there were inherent qualities. So they did associate, whether they called it race or nationality, and they frequently did call it race. It did come with inherent distinctive virtues in their perception.
I mean, you find it even, for example, in writings by William Saroyan in that period, who was not exactly a classic nationalist of either party, but he will refer to the race. It was
Okay. Yeah.
not uncommon. Any questions here? Yes, sir.
I don't have a question, but I have a few comments.
You want to take the microphone because we have an online audience.
Oh, thanks. Few comments. Regarding the popularity of the parties, this is a number I do remember. After the first independence of Armenia, the members of the ARF, the number was more than 100,000 members, versus the Hunchaks, 1,200 something, because they were divided, 2 or 3 different groups, and the Ramgavars, which came in 1908, which was a combination of Hunchaks and few progressive people. So that's one comment. The second thing, you talked about the church, the division. During the Cold War, the Soviet used and abused the Armenian church and the clergy. So there was a lot of reaction to that. Number 3, about Tro, but you said it rightly. Tro was a national person. He wanted to serve his nation. There were more than 35 or 40,000 Armenian prisoners with the Germans. He was trying to find a solution to that. And one of the consequences of that was creation of Ancha, which is basically those who don't have any nationality or citizenship. He was trying to help them to do that also. Plus few other considerations which you mentioned. What else? Well, these are comments. I mean, I'm making comments. I'm not. On the other hand, I'm fascinated with the way you talked and presented your book. It's fascinating.
Thank you.
I mean, it's really how the community that we live in today,
Yes.
if we live in the community today, came into being. So it's really incredibly valuable work. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
Another thing I remember, in 1965, no, I will not give it easily. 1965, I was in college when the first celebration, I will call it, of remembrance of the genocide happened in Beirut. I was in Beirut at that time. The stadium, which was 55,000 people capacity, there were more than 70,000 people. And it was organized by the 3 parties, 3 of them. So from that day on, the being party member took a different color. We started working together with other parties also. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I think that coming together took a little longer to be formalized in the United States than in Beirut, but yes, it certainly was underway here in 1965.
And I was reminded recently, Ben, that the divisions also go back a little bit further even. I a week or 2 ago went down one particular rabbit hole reading about the violence in Boston in the early 1900s, including attempted assassinations within the Hunchak party. The Hunchaks and the Reformed Hunchaks were trying to bump each other off in the streets of Boston in 1903, 1904. It's really quite fascinating stuff to read about. Again, another subject ripe for further exploration by an enterprising historian.
Yeah.
So, I hope they will. Harry.
I'd just like to make,
Microphone.
Yeah, go right ahead, please.
I just would like to say that I think this is one of the finest lectures I've ever attended.
Thank you. Closer to the mic.
Excellent, excellent. And some of the names that you use there, Varjan Samuelian, somebody that I knew because he was from East Watertown, and he was the editor of the thing, and Jimmy Tashjan as well. So you're in the generation that I grew up in, and you've done such a wonderful job narrating the whole history during that period of time. The best I've seen. Thank you.
Thank you.
And not just because it's the only one.
So you said you knew Varujan Samuelian.
Very well.
Okay, yeah.
We just hang around in the same corner of Dexter Avenue and so forth.
Oh.
So there was a click there in East Watertown.
Juicy tidbits, yeah.
And Varjan, yeah, very well.
Yes, Adrian.
I'm trying to remember when the first genocide commemoration where they all got together.
In Boston or
In Boston.
anywhere?
Yeah,
Oh,
in Boston.
I don't know.
Usually with the 50th, I think, brought people together, the 50th anniversary.
1965?
Could be.
Oh, yeah, one thing that I want to note is that in the decades prior, there were commemorations of specific episodes within. The holdout at Van, the holdout at Musadag, particular episodes of Armenian bravery. It took longer to think of it as one big package with a name, the genocide. But there were commemorations. There were commemorations of one sort or another from very early on.
Excellent presentation. A question concerning the 1956, when the Catholicos came and the PLC was formed over here. One could argue that the churches operated, 15 or 16 churches. Those Armenians were disenfranchised from the Armenian church. And what would have happened if, in fact, the prelacy was not formed, in your opinion? The forming, and I happen to be a diocese person, okay, very strong in heart, but I also look at the fact that if the prelacy was not formed, I just wonder what would have happened to all the Armenians that felt disenfranchised from the Armenian church because of their political beliefs.
Oh, well, the thing is, they did have congregations, with or without the prelacy. They had congregations. So it would seem to me that if they didn't form something formally, they would have formed something informally. Before we go further, I have a question. When I was making my opening remarks, did I remember to mention Shushan Tiger? No. Okay. I deeply regret that, and I had that written down. I wasn't looking at my notes. So I just want to say that in my gratitude to NAASR, that includes the late Shushan Tiger. She and I had a number of very informative conversations, and I also very much appreciated the work that she was doing here as a member of the board. Specifically, she was working to acquire as many records as possible of compatriotic societies, that is, organizations dedicated to specific villages back in the old world. And that in itself is a subject in need of more research. So again, I want to make a tribute to Shushan Tiger, whom I very much appreciate.
Thanks. Thank you for
Okay.
that.
Okay, thank you.
We really miss her. Yeah, Thank you. And yes, she was a strong advocate for the library in general, and certainly for archives and materials of that kind. And thank you also for that nice plug in your talk, which I would very much second, that materials that can be used by historians and that are just sitting in a box or worse in your house should be in an institution and in a library such as NAASR's, where they can be made use of by researchers.
And let me also add, this includes, though it's not limited to, any and all records of any kind of organization or club that has anything to do with Armenians. If you've got records of that nature sitting in boxes, those boxes should be here getting sorted through by a qualified library staff, or in some special collections library. NAASR is a very good one, but the point is they should be somewhere other than locked away in storage rooms.
Amen. Well, amen. And again, thank you to Joan for sponsoring this lecture in memory of her uncle.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we invite you to purchase, either online or in person, Ben's outstanding book, Ararat in America, and see you next time.
And I'm glad to sign books. Okay.
Better be.
Yeah. Let me take a seat at the table. Okay, sure. Okay.